General Hospital spoilers reveal that Elizabeth had been called to the stand many times in her life, but never like this. Never with the weight of an entire family's future balanced on the fragile edge of her own conscience. From the moment Drew was shot, she had been collecting fragments of truth the way a nurse collects vital signs, quietly, precisely, instinctually. Yet the truth she carried now was far from clinical. It was emotional, volatile, capable of detonating relationships and reputations with the same force as the bullets that tore into Drew's back. She knew details others had dismissed as coincidence, small changes in timelines, shifts in behavior, fragments overheard in hallways or whispered in moments when people forgot a nurse is trained to listen even when she looks distracted. Those fragments had formed a picture Liz had been trying not to see, one that placed Willow in the line of fire and Michael in the shadow of decisions that could destroy everything the Quartermaines believed about themselves. What she knew was not a simple accusation, and it certainly was not something she had gone searching for. It was a kind of truth that finds you, traps you, and demands you choose between protection and justice, between compassion and consequences. Liz understood that the prosecution saw her as a stabilizer, someone grounded, someone who could be trusted to relay events without embellishment. What they did not understand was that Liz's neutrality had already been compromised. The moment she discovered Willow's vulnerability, she had watched Willow struggle to piece together her life after the chaos of her illness, watched her cling to the fragile piece she had carved out with Michael, watched her try to be the kind of mother who could forget the trauma in her veins long enough to give her daughter a chance at normalcy. And now, all of that was under threat. If Liz spoke the truth with too much clarity, Willow would be pulled into the vortex of suspicion, forced to answer for moments that were being twisted into motive. If she held back, even slightly, Michael would shoulder the weight of improvised timelines and missing minutes that prosecutors were eager to use against him. Liz had become the silent hinge of the entire case, the witness who didn't need to lie to destroy someone. She only needed to choose which truth to tell, and how much of it to let the world hear. The courtroom had already begun to buzz with predictions about what her testimony would mean. Tracy understood better than anyone that the Quartermaine dynasty could implode from the inside if the wrong connections were made. She had been watching Michael with an intensity sharpened by decades of protecting her family's name, and she could see the calculation forming behind Liz's calm expression. Tracy knew that Liz was not someone who lashed out impulsively, but she was someone driven by moral responsibility, especially where children and vulnerable people were concerned. If Liz believed Willow's future was in danger, she would protect her. If Liz believed Michael had crossed a line trying to protect Willow, she might expose him. And if Liz believed the Quartermaines were hiding something, she would not hesitate to bring it to light. Tracy felt the ground shifting beneath her feet long before the rest of the family sensed the cracks forming. What frightened Tracy most was the realization that Liz had seen and heard far more than she ever let on. She had been present at the hospital when Drew was brought in, when Michael arrived before the police even confirmed the timeline, when Willow's panic spiraled into questions she couldn't answer. Liz had watched Willow tremble at the idea that her name might appear in police reports, watched Michael pull her aside more than once to calm her down, watched the subtle arguments masked behind closed doors when they thought no one was paying attention. Liz had begun to notice inconsistencies, a misplaced jacket, a message timestamp that didn't match the story, a moment Willow couldn't account for because she'd been dissociating from stress. Nothing criminal on its own, but in the right or wrong hands, it could be used to paint a picture none of them deserved. The prosecutors had begun circling those inconsistencies like sharks sensing blood in the water. Tracy had seen their strategy forming, and she knew Liz was the obstacle standing between the Quartermaines and bloodshed. Liz also knew, with growing unease, that her testimony would influence more than a verdict. It would influence how poor Charles saw her. If she protected Willow, people would accuse her of bias, of favoring a fellow mother, of choosing emotion over truth. If she protected Michael, people would whisper that she had overlooked evidence because she cared too much about the Quartermaines. If she told the court everything she suspected but couldn't prove, she risked becoming the reason a family turned on itself, fragmenting into blame and resentment. And yet, remaining silent was not an option. Drew deserved justice. The truth deserved airtime, even if filtered through painful nuance. Liz had been living with these questions for nights on end, turning them over like stones in her hand, hoping for a direction, a sign, something to tell her which path was right. The deeper she thought, the more she realized that everyone involved was terrified. Michael had been unraveling, consumed by the idea that his past choices were catching up to him. He was hiding something, but not necessarily guilt. It felt more like desperation, like he knew someone else's freedom depended on him staying quiet. Willow was equally fragile, battling old fears. fearing that any misstep would send her life spiraling back into chaos. Even Tracy, the unshakable matriarch, was masking her anxiety behind cutting remarks and rigid posture. Liz could see how the entire Quartermain family was holding its breath, as though one sharp exhale might collapse a web of lies, omissions, and half-truths strung across their lives. Liz had spent her life cleaning up after the emotional wreckage of others, but this time the wreckage was approaching her like a storm surge. She had stumbled upon information that connected the puzzle pieces in dangerous ways, especially regarding the timing of Willow's presence near the crime scene, and Michael's contradictory accounts. She wasn't sure whether Michael was covering for Willow or someone else entirely, but the more she replayed the night in her mind, the more she sensed a coordinated effort to shift suspicion. Those adjustments were subtle at first. Michael's insistence that Willow stay out of the narrative, his overprotective reactions whenever law enforcement asked her questions, and the way Tracy immediately intervened every time someone mentioned Willow's name. It wasn't hard to recognize when a family was terrified of exposure. The true danger, Liz realized, was not whether Michael pulled the trigger. It was whether the Quartermains had conspired, even unintentionally, to alter the truth. A conspiracy born not of malice but fear. Fear of losing Willow. Fear of destroying Michael's life. Fear of letting Drew's shooting reopen wounds the family was desperate to keep closed. That fear had created new dangers, new behaviors, new shadows. And Liz was the only person positioned between the truth and the collapse of one of Port Charles' most powerful families. What made the situation even more precarious was the prosecution's renewed focus on Jacinda's testimony. If Jacinda's timeline collapsed under scrutiny, the court would turn immediately to Liz, seeing her as a more reliable pillar. That shift in pressure meant Liz no longer had the luxury of being cautious. Her words would become the official record, the version of events future historians, lawyers, and gossip mongers would quote. Liz knew she had to speak with clinical precision, while still protecting those who did not deserve additional suffering. The balance was excruciating. One misplaced sentence could condemn Michael. One omitted detail could place Willow on the stand. One overly honest remark could draw Tracy's wrath and force her to defend the Quartermain name at any cost. As Liz prepared to step into the courtroom, she felt the weight of every secret, every choice, every life that would be altered by her testimony. She had always believed truth brought clarity, but here the truth was a weapon, sharp enough to wound everyone involved. She was not simply a witness anymore. She had become the axis upon which futures turned, and deep down, she could feel something darker brewing beneath the surface. Something that suggested Drew's shooting was only the beginning of a much larger unraveling one. That would not stop, no matter how carefully she chose her words. Because once Liz spoke, nothing in the Quartermain world would ever be the same again. Elizabeth had always been someone who reacted to chaos rather than initiated, a steady presence in a world that constantly demanded more strength than any one person should possess. But something had changed deep inside her in the weeks following the shooting of Drew. Something subtle at first, then sharper, then impossible to ignore. She found herself thinking not just as a witness, not just as a nurse, not just as a woman who cared about justice, but as someone quietly, deliberately calculating the ripples of every possible outcome. She had stepped into a realm she had avoided most of her life, strategic thinking, silent maneuvering, the kind of careful manipulation born not from malice but from necessity. The future of too many people she cared about hung in a fragile balance, and Liz realized she could no longer be passive. She had to choose where her protection fell, who she would shield, who she might quietly expose, and what she was willing to carry if her choices fractured an entire family. Willow's stability was slipping through her fingers as pressure mounted around her, and Scout's fragile world was cracking as the truth about Drew's final moments grew more distorted. Liz could see all of this with painful clarity, and she knew that doing nothing would be its own form of cruelty. What haunted Liz most was the way Willow's face changed. Whenever the investigation turned toward the timeline, Willow was trying to be strong, trying to act as though she could survive whatever questions were thrown at her. But Liz could see the truth behind the mask. Willow was unraveling in quiet increments, the way people do when they are terrified of being misunderstood, terrified of being used as a pawn in someone else's narrative. Liz had watched too many young mothers fight for their sanity in the wake of trauma, and she saw all the signs in Willow, the glassy stare, the trembling breath, the way she clung to structure and routine as though it could anchor her. Liz began to understand how dangerous it would be if Willow were dragged into the courtroom. If her fragile emotional state were dissected by lawyers who cared more about winning than preservation. That was when Liz felt something shift inside her, a fierce determination that surprised even herself. She needed to protect Willow, not simply because it was a morally right thing to do, but because she sensed that Willow's collapse would set off a chain reaction that would destroy more than one life, including Scout's. Scout had already lost too much. Liz could still remember the numb silence that followed every update about Drew's condition. The way Scout's small hands tightened whenever people whispered around her. Children understood more than adults realized. And Scout was absorbing the emotional atmosphere like a sponge. She sensed danger, loss, and instability even when no one said a word. Liz knew that if the investigation began painting Willow as a suspect, or even a person of interest, Michael would unravel and Scout would be caught in the fallout. Liz saw the connection forming before anyone else did. If the prosecution aimed at Willow, Michael would react with desperate, reckless intensity. If Michael fell apart, the Quartermain family would be thrown into another war within itself. And when the Quartermains fought, there were no survivors. Everyone became collateral damage. Liz had worked in that hospital long enough to see what family pressure could do to a child. She would not let Scout become another casualty. These realizations forced Liz into a position she never expected to occupy. She began examining every detail she knew about the night Drew was shot, not only through the lens of truth, but through the lens of strategy. She had fragments of information that could be interpreted in more than one way, and this terrified her. A detail shared too bluntly could destroy Michael. A detail withheld too long could place Willow in the crosshairs. Liz found herself rehearsing different versions of her testimony late at night, pacing through scenarios in her mind, identifying which facts were essential and which were dangerous. She wasn't lying. She refused to lie, but she understood that truth could be shaped by the order in which it was presented, the emphasis placed on certain moments, the context added or omitted. She hated thinking like this, hated feeling the echo of manipulation in her chest. But the stakes were too high to pretend she could simply walk into a courtroom and speak without intention. Her intuition had sharpened into something more tactical, more deliberate, and it frightened her how natural it began to feel. What unsettled Liz further was the growing awareness that she was becoming the fulcrum of decisions she did not fully understand. The prosecutors were watching her carefully, sensing that she held details that could shift momentum. Tracy Quartermain was watching her too, with an intensity sharpened by decades of navigating family disasters. Tracy understood the danger of a witness who had both morality and motive. Liz could feel Tracy testing her, evaluating her, trying to measure the threat she posed. And Liz realized with a strange sense of clarity that this was the first time someone like Tracy actually feared what she might do. That fear was confirmation of the power Liz carried. Power she had never asked for but now wielded with quiet precision. It was the kind of power that made her appear unpredictable, even dangerous. To those who had underestimated her, Liz found herself replaying her interactions with Willow and Michael, recognizing subtle details that once seemed harmless. Michael's rushed explanations, his insistence that Willow avoid certain conversations, the panic in his eyes when officials asked about her timeline, all of it had a pattern. Liz now understood. Something had happened that night, something Michael was bending reality to protect. Whether he was covering for Willow or shielding someone else, Liz could not yet tell. But she could feel the tension radiating beneath his choices, a tension that suggested fear, not guilt. Fear of Willow falling apart, fear of losing his family, fear of the truth being twisted against the wrong person. Liz could see him slipping into a place where loyalty and desperation blurred into a dangerous mix, one that could explode under legal pressure. As Liz's understanding deepened, so did her resolve. She started shaping a plan, not a scheme, not a deception, but a framework she could rely on when the courtroom became a battlefield. She identified the details she would emphasize, the moments she would contextualize carefully, the emotional truths she would lean on when logic alone was too sharp. She would make it clear that Willow had been overwhelmed, struggling, emotionally exhausted, but not violent, not reckless, not capable of pulling a trigger in a moment of rage or panic. She would highlight Michael's protective instincts in ways that suggested love, not guilt. And she would ensure that Scout's future was woven into the narrative, subtly but powerfully, to remind everyone, including the prosecution, that this case was not merely about crime, but about the survival of a family already wounded. What shocked Liz most was how naturally these thoughts came to her, once she allowed herself to consider them. She had spent years believing she had to remain neutral, believing that justice must come above all personal connections. But life had taught her, painfully and repeatedly, that justice was not always pure, that truth could be brutal, that systems meant to protect often inflicted harm. She realized she was not choosing dishonesty. She was choosing compassion in a world that rarely rewarded it. Her calculations were not born from selfishness, but from a deep, instinctual need to shield those who were most vulnerable. She had not expected to become this version of herself, someone capable of crafting outcomes rather than observing them. Yet here she was, caught between truth and protection, shaping a new path through instinctive survival. The more Liz embraced this internal shift, the more powerful and unsettling it became. She could feel eyes on her everywhere she went, lawyers, family members, hospital staff, all of them waiting for a sign of which direction she would lean. They sensed the energy around her changing, sensed the gravity she carried even without speaking, and Liz recognized that she was becoming an unpredictable force. Someone people could not easily read. Someone capable of altering the trajectory of the case in ways no one expected. That realization filled her with dread and strength at the same time. Her transformation into a strategic thinker created a kind of madness in the eyes of others. A silent chaos no one could articulate, but everyone could feel. People whispered about her certainty, her calm, her unreadable expression, and they were right to be unsettled. Liz was no longer simply participating in the case. She was reshaping it with every breath. And when she finally took the stand, when she lifted her eyes to the courtroom and allowed her voice to steady, the real shock would not come from what she revealed but from the undeniable truth that Elizabeth Weber had evolved into the one person capable of turning the entire case upside down in a single, calculated moment. Willow was never meant to walk out of that courtroom untouched. Not after what she had done. Not after the bullet she fired tore into Drew and set off the chain reaction that now threatened to destroy half of Port Charles. Yet somehow, impossibly, she emerged from the legal battlefield with her freedom intact. Her name wiped clean by a verdict that felt less like justice, and more like the product of invisible hands rearranging destiny itself. Those who watched her step outside the courthouse that day did not fully understand what had just happened, but they could feel the tremor of it because the truth had not vanished. It had merely been buried beneath layers of calculation, fear, and sacrifice, and the person who had buried it most carefully was Elizabeth. Liz had known the truth long before anyone else. She knew Willow had been the one holding the gun. She knew the panic, the dissociation, the trembling confusion that had swallowed Willow the moment she acted. But Liz also knew that Willow had not been driven by hatred nor revenge, nor any impulse that resembled malice. It had been fear, pure, brutal, suffocating fear, and Liz had seen enough trauma victims to recognize the instinctive collapse of someone who had already been fighting for her life, long before the trigger was pulled. What Willow needed was protection, not punishment. What Scout needed was stability, not the trauma of watching another parental figure be dragged through prison bars. And what Michael needed, whether he realized it or not, was someone to stop him from sacrificing himself. In a misguided attempt to rewrite the narrative, the verdict granting Willow her freedom should have ended the anxiety that had hovered over the Quartermain family like a permanent storm cloud. But instead, it marked the beginning of something darker, something twisted by the burden of secrets that no longer aligned with the public truth. Because now Michael was the one being hunted not by the law, but by the consequences of every lie he told and every timeline he adjusted to keep Willow safe. Jacinda, too, found herself pulled deeper into the prosecution's backlash. Her earlier claims about being with Michael during the shooting were now under attack, scrutinized relentlessly, dissected as though every syllable she spoke had been designed to mislead the court. The investigators needed to target someone to blame for a system failure that allowed the true shooter to walk free. And the easiest targets were the two people who had stepped into the fire to shield Willow. Michael had always believed he could handle consequences, no matter how heavy they became. But he had never faced consequences like these. Reporters swarmed him. Online speculation spiraled out of control. Anonymous messages filled with threats poured in. Business partners began distancing themselves. Tracy warned him that the Quartermain name could only shield him so far before it, too, would be dragged through the mud. And Jacinda, whose testimony had already been questioned, suddenly became the second. More convenient suspects. Some saw her as an accomplice, others as a possible shooter herself. Her life began to crumble in small, devastating increments. Her job became unstable. Her friendships fractured. And the anxiety that had once clung only to Willow now ensnared them both. It was in this chaos that the true shock began to form, the shift in Liz's role, from witness to unseen architect. Because the more the world turned against Michael and Jacinda, the more Liz realized the devastating paradox she had helped create. Willow was free, yes, but the weight of her freedom had been placed squarely on the shoulders of others. Liz could feel the contradiction pulling at her conscience. She had fought to protect Willow, yet the cost of that protection had begun infecting the very people who should have been the ones helping her heal. Her strategy had been born from instinct, but its consequences had spiraled far beyond what she anticipated. And so Liz began planning again, not out of guilt, but out of necessity. She saw the fracture lines forming long before they were visible to the public. She saw how Michael's growing paranoia made him act erratically, how Jacinda's fear made her vulnerable to manipulation, how the prosecution's humiliation fueled their hunger for retaliation. She knew all of this would eventually circle back toward Willow, because secrets never remain buried forever. They simply wait for the right moment to claw their way back to the surface. Liz understood that the next attack, whether legal, personal, or emotional, would not be directed at Michael or Jacinda alone. It would eventually reach Willow again. And when that happened, the freedom Liz fought for would collapse like a house of cards. What terrified Liz most was that someone else seemed to know the truth as well, or at least enough of it to weaponize it. Anonymous threats targeted Michael. Cryptic messages warned Jacinda that the truth would come out. No matter how hard she tried to hide it, paparazzi began appearing outside the hospital, hunting for inconsistencies in Liz's behavior. Someone was watching them all, waiting for the moment one of them would break. And Liz could feel that the foundation beneath their feet was crumbling faster than she could stabilize it. The public believed that the courtroom ordeal was the climax of the story, but Liz could see that it was merely the first act of something much more dangerous. Willow's freedom had not healed anything. It had not closed any wounds. Instead, it had opened new ones, deep, raw, and invisible to those who weren't paying attention. The guilt Willow carried, suffocating her more each day, was beginning to distort her sense of reality. Michael's desperate defenses were beginning to look like confessions to those who did not know the truth. Jacinda's involvement was beginning to take on the shape of conspiracy, even though she had never intended to mislead anyone. And the most devastating part was that Liz knew exactly how fragile this new balance was. One rumor, one leaked document, one unexpected witness, one moment of weakness from Willow herself. That was all it would take to ignite everything. The shift happening inside Liz became its own kind of madness, not chaos, but cold, meticulous awareness. She was not simply responding to events. She was beginning to anticipate them before they happened. She could see the next crisis forming, the next threat approaching, the next betrayal readying itself. She understood that she would soon have to decide whether to double down on the truth. She helped construct or dismantle it before it collapsed and crushed everyone underneath. And that decision would not be easy. Because protecting Willow now meant protecting the lie. But protecting the lie meant letting Michael and Jacinda suffer for a crime they did not commit. As the pressure mounted, as the shadows around the truth grew sharper, Liz felt something dark and unmistakable settle into her chest. A realization that the next shock in this story would not come from the courtroom, nor from the law, nor even from the public. The next shock would come from her. Because Liz now held the power to decide whether the truth lived or died. And no matter which path she chose, someone's world was going to shatter.